British police have issued a warning about what's being described as a chemical haze on the Sussex coast in southern England. Up to 50 people have suffered irritation to their eyes and throats on Sunday. Police urged people to keep doors and windows shut in the affected area. They also warned people to stay away from the beaches on a busy public holiday weekend. Officials say the haze seemed to have been coming in from the sea, but the source has not been established.
On Sunday, beachgoers at a popular destination about 60 miles south of London were engulfed by a mysterious chemical haze, resulting in stinging eyes, difficulty breathing, and vomiting. Over 150 people were treated at hospitals for their injuries, which authorities said were mostly minor. However, police believe hundreds more were affected by the plume of gas. According to a statement from the Sussex police, neither the gas nor its source have been established, but agencies are continuing to investigate and have not ruled out either onshore or offshore locations.
Good morning.
Dr. Zhang Chu has been recognized by the Governor General's Innovation Awards.
This work can't be done without teamwork.
She and the team at the National Microbiology Lab have been praised for developing an Ebola vaccine. But just over a week ago, Chu, her husband, and her students from China were evicted from Canada's only Level 4 lab, their security access revoked. Staff at the lab was told last Monday the couple is on leave and not to communicate with them. We're getting this from sources who work at the lab, but who don't want to be identified for fears they'll be punished. They say this is coming just months after IT specialists entered Chu's office after hours and replaced her computer, and her superiors stopped authorizing work trips to China. Manitoba RCMP confirmed it was called in by the Public Health Agency of Canada on May 24th. A spokesperson says the agency is investigating a policy breach, calling it an administrative matter, and it's taking steps to resolve it expeditiously. We can assure Canadians that there is no risk to the public and that the work of the NML continues in support of the health and safety of all Canadians.
All this, of course, is unproven, but even microbiology, sometimes especially microbiology, can have issues that involve national security.
That this virus was produced in a laboratory, and certainly there is no evidence that this virus was produced in a laboratory, and certainly no evidence that it was produced as a biological weapon. Coronaviruses. COVID-19 is what's called a coronavirus. It's a class of viruses that are primarily what we call zoonotic.
I had a little bird. His name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza.
Perhaps until recently, Spanish flu has been what some people call a forgotten pandemic. But it was a huge global calamity. In terms of the number of deaths, we're saying 50 to 100 million, far greater than the casualties of the First World War. Roughly around April, May 1918, when, the carnage of the First World War is graphic and horrendous. But at the same time, this unknown enemy is starting to sweep through the US, Europe, the trenches, and it is recorded by the Spanish press, and it becomes dubbed as the Spanish flu because they are neutral. Well, at the time in the 1920s, they estimated that maybe 20 million had died. By the late 20th century, that figure had been up to 25 million. In the 21st century, with scientists and historians now getting together to work much more closely, that figure has now been upped to 50 to 100 million people killed. This virus killed more people in the first 25 weeks than HIV/AIDS has killed in 25 years. Horrendous. I mean, those mortality statistics are staggering.
We don't know exactly why some flu strains are much more severe than others and why some of them would be more likely to kill people or cause very severe disease.
What is particular about avian and pandemic viruses is that they replicate deep inside our lungs. When our cells detect this and trigger a very strong innate immune response, this leads to an influx of white blood cells and fluids into our lungs, and it restricts the amount of airspace that we have to breathe.
The symptoms are very graphic and very, very striking. So, it's said that some people drowned in their own phlegm. So if it was hitting or affecting the lungs, people were spurting blood from their ears and their noses. Descriptions of people turning blue or purple. So, it was really, really severe, and people just dropping down in the streets. Those that succumbed to the flu were in the age group 20 to 40 years, which is very unusual for an influenza epidemic or pandemic. And scientists and historians are now still looking to see why.
There's really two ways that people died in 1918. They either died from the initial flu infection, or they died from an enormously strong immune response to that virus, where their lungs just filled up with fluids from trying to attack the virus that got into their lungs.
So traditionally, everyone sort of said, oh, well, it was the trenches, and, the conditions of the war, and that's why it was so fatal. But then you think, well, how did it spread so rapidly around the world to places that are not part of the theatre of war? I think the traditional explanation is it starts in Kansas, in an army camp, and then the troops bring it over to the trenches, Europe. But there's still many, many unknowns.
So mathematical modellers have long been interested in the 1918 pandemic, and one of the questions is to try and disentangle how it spread around the world and exactly what the routes have been. Given perfect data, you could work backwards and try to infer where it's come from. Whereabouts does it arrive in a country? Does it arrive multiple times? Or thinking about multiple countries, where is the first place? If you understand the origin of a pandemic, then you understand something about where it's come from, and maybe you can stop that in future.
Almost certainly it was a bird flu originally. But then we also know that that flu, or something very similar to it, was in pigs at the same time. Maybe it's somebody who works very closely with birds, or who works very closely with pigs, or has some other exposure like that. One of the big, really open questions in flu research and flu public health is, how does the virus adapt from one species to another? How does, for example, a virus in pigs or in birds get into humans and then start transmitting? Then the key question is, how does the virus then adapt within that person to stop being a pig virus or a bird virus and become a human virus? In other words, to be able to transmit from human to human. And it's probably some very quick evolutionary process that is going on within that human, and in many cases won't be successful, but in a few cases will, and that's when the virus can start spreading between humans and become a flu pandemic, and then stay in humans as regular seasonal flu.
Just as people were celebrating Armistice Day, there was hope that it was dying down, but then it resurged. A far more deadly and virulent strain emerged. So this second wave really spread like wildfire, affecting a third or a quarter of the population of the world. And it was short-lived, so it petered out not long afterwards, maybe in 1920, 1921. But it was in the sense, short-lived.
What happened is that virus continued to transmit among humans. In fact, it continued until 1957 to transmit between humans. And probably what happened there is that the virus adapted to humans. It wasn't this avian or swine virus that came in and was accidentally more pathogenic in humans. In our lab here in Cambridge, we study both seasonal flu and pandemic flu from the standpoint of how does the virus evolve, and how can we predict that evolution and make vaccines to try to artificially evolve the virus both in the laboratory and in the computer to understand what it's going to do next and to make vaccines against those strains that will evolve in the future. So this is the basic science of studying evolution and trying to predict that evolution, something that nobody's ever been able to do for a complex organism. And then working to use that understanding to make better vaccines. On the pandemic flu side, we do a similar thing where we look to see how that virus is changing, how it changes in birds and how it changes in, how that virus changes in other species, and to try to see what possible variants out there might be, and again, to make vaccines that could protect against all of those variants that we see.
Flu is very difficult to eradicate because it's constantly mutating and changing its genetic information. We work on the influenza virus, and in particular on the enzyme that copies the genetic information of the virus when it enters our cells. Specifically, we're interested in how this enzyme can do this activity and how it inserts mutations in the viral genome that lead to the formation of new strains to which we need to develop new vaccines. And we are also interested in when this enzyme messes up, how it triggers the innate immune system and helps cause disease.
We really don't know why we haven't seen a pandemic as deadly as the 1918 pandemic. Scientists and public health officials are extremely concerned. The National Risk Register, which is the way that our government plans what are all the risks to civil society in the UK, there's only 2 events that are up there in terms of the most catastrophic, and that's a terrorist event or an influenza pandemic. There is a real threat that there can be such pandemics. For example, the H5 and the H7 flu viruses that have infected now close to 2,000 people and killed about half of them. There has been with the H7 viruses some transmission from human to human, not very efficient, and it hasn't really taken off. If either of those viruses did adapt to really transmit well between humans, there's a real concern that it could be as bad as the 1918 virus. And this is why there is so much research done for the public good to try to understand what's happening, and so much work done by people in public health and preparing in hospitals in case something like that happens.
Well, experts like to say it's not if, but when. Coming as a mathematician, it's happened a lot of times in the past. It'll probably happen again. The 1918 pandemic is difficult because of lack of data, but the most recent influenza pandemic we had was in 2009. And from that pandemic, there is some very good data. If we understand how the 2009 pandemic spread, maybe that tells us something we can use to help control future pandemics. If we can't stop them, the alternative is at least to allocate our resources better to try and reduce the number of cases in each place.
Looking back 100 years to the last pandemic also invites the question of 100 years from now, what will we be like in terms of how well we are protected against flu, or what things we could do to protect ourselves in some situations? Surely we'll be in a situation where we know more about what viruses are in the world and where they are. Surveillance will be so much better. Surely we'll be in a better situation where we have better drugs and better vaccines because we know more about the virus, so we know more about its weaknesses. We know more about our immune systems, and we know how to enable them to fight those pathogens better. At some point, we will have a universal vaccine that will protect us against flu for the rest of our lives. When this is a whole other question. There are a great number of approaches and really good ideas to doing this. There are already attempts at this that are at a quite advanced stage. It might be 10 years from now. It might be 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. We really don't know.
In 1968, about 6,000 sheep died near this government facility. They were poisoned by a chemical weapon named VX. The U.S. hasn't been known to actively use VX in combat. In fact, it's begun destroying its stockpile of chemical munitions as part of a UN treaty. But it's just one of many strange and secretive experiments that happened within these walls. Experiments on sheep, mosquitoes, and even civilians. About 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City is the U.S. government's top secret bioweapons lab. It's called the Dugway Proving Ground. The 77-year-old facility covers about 800,000 acres. That's just a little larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. And it tests some of the deadliest chemical, biological, radiological, and explosive hazards on Earth. Less famous than Area 51, Dugway dates all the way back to 1942, right in the middle of World War II.
The decisive battle of the war has begun.
The government needed a large area to test powerful weapons, eventually settling on this stretch of land in the Utah desert. Back then, the site was used to test everything from chemical sprays and flamethrowers to various antidotes and protective equipment, and even firebombing. After World War II, Dugway mostly shut down until the Korean War began in 1950. That's when the proving ground turned into what it is today, a permanent military base. In Dugway's first few decades, the base worked mostly on offensive weaponry, biological and chemical munitions designed to directly attack enemies.
Sampling devices positioned throughout the test area yield valuable information to Chemical Corps researchers.
The 1950s, for example, saw the launch of Operation Big Itch, an experiment that was testing weaponized fleas. The fleas weren't infected with any type of disease or agent, but experimenters were working with thousands of them, and the fleas were dropped in cluster bombs to gauge if they would survive the fall from an airplane. And this was only part one. Dugway launched a second experiment called Project Bellwether in the 1960s. Only this time, mosquitoes were injected with inert diseases, inert bacteria, and inert viruses. But get this, those mosquitoes were released upon several groups of human volunteers who were bitten again and again during the trials. And there are records dating back to the late 1950s, which describe experiments that used infected mosquitoes. And those are just two experiments known to the public. Exactly what goes on at Dugway is, well, pretty unclear. And that's not by accident. The area is intensely guarded. Everything that comes in and out is carefully monitored. Guards are on constant patrol and actively armed, and the perimeter is lined with tall barbed wire fencing. There are even signs that authorize deadly force when necessary. Since the 1940s, officials say operations have shifted from offensive to defensive tactics. Case in point, most of the current known work prepares agents to defend against potential biological and chemical attacks. For example, a multitude of training programs are held on site for the armed forces. Here's one in which Army Reserve soldiers are tasked with checking the radiation levels of artillery rounds. And here's another where soldiers were tasked with identifying substances in a simulated chemical lab. Dugway's main operations include the Brock Training Facility, constructed from various shipping containers. It simulates underground environments for military training. There are also various buildings and rooms that serve specific purposes, like the decontamination testing chamber, the wind tunnel testing room, and the material test facility. But perhaps the most interesting room of all is this, the Smart Man Laboratory Facility, which houses the Smart Man Dummy, a model that's used to simulate human contact with chemical agents, including the infamous VX nerve agent. Specifically, the Smart Man helps the lab develop more effective individual protection respiratory equipment, essentially gas masks and the like. A variety of chemists, chemical analysts, and technicians work on site. And the use of airtight chambers and gas masks is not only common, but mandatory. Despite all of this dangerous experimentation, the work done at Dugway hasn't always been properly contained. Remember that sheep incident? That marked the start of a worrisome track record. It happened when overhead planes spewed out the nerve agent into the wind, accidentally sending it into nearby farmland in Skull Valley. Within the next couple of days, farmers found thousands of sheep dead in their fields. The army compensated the farmers and lent them bulldozers to bury the sheep. But the accident sparked a whole debate on the use of chemical weapons in warfare. Adding on to these questionable practices, a 1994 Senate hearing on veterans' health focused specifically on Dugway veterans and civilians. A report found that people at Dugway were exposed to biological and chemical simulants believed to be safe at the time, but that the Army had later stopped using many of them because they realized they were not as safe as previously believed. One veteran, who was accidentally sprayed in the face with the chemical DMMP in 1984, found himself wheezing and coughing the next day, symptoms that ended up lasting several weeks. Despite this, he was given only cough medicine and antibiotics by the Dugway Army Hospital. The Dugway Safety Office assured him that the chemical was safe, but by 1988, officials at Dugway had reevaluated the simulant's danger and were concerned it could cause cancer and kidney damage. In 2011, the facility slipped up again. It went on lockdown after workers lost a vial containing the VX nerve agent. Nobody was permitted to enter or exit the facility, not even the employees. And in 2016, the CDC and the Department of Defense launched a major investigation when a review team found that Dugway had been operating dangerously for several years without the government's knowledge. USA Today reported egregious failures by the facility's leadership and staff. The report singled out the head colonel in command at Dugway, Brigadier General William King. The Army's accountability investigation recognized King as unqualified, lacking the education and training to effectively oversee biosafety procedures crucial to Dugway's operation. The report admonished him, saying he repeatedly deflected blame and minimized the severity of incidents. It even says King fails to recognize how serious the incidents truly were. And how serious were the incidents exactly? Well, under King's command, the facility mistakenly shipped live anthrax to other labs. And not just once, but multiple times, for over a decade. That same report revealed that workers had been regularly and deliberately manipulating data in important records. Records meant to verify that pathogens being transported elsewhere were killed and safe for researchers to handle without protective gear. Still, the facility's shady past, secretive operations, and intense surveillance have captured the attention and skepticism of some closer observers, including several conspiracy theorist groups. There are suggestions that the facility is the new Area 51, and the local community has raised their own questions about the facility's operations. Dugway was even featured in an episode of the History Channel's UFO Hunters, in which local residents and UFO watchers were interviewed and footage from the area was examined. It's hard not to wonder when you live in close proximity to such a restricted landscape. Despite these theories, Dugway has expressed a desire to be more transparent. And representatives have said the facility wants to be more a part of the local community by better informing citizens about what exactly goes on there. So far, they've delivered some on that. The facility has its own events page, which lists several events open to the general public and the local Utah community. This year, they're hosting a trail race on the facility grounds. Certainly, today's Dugway is a far cry from the 1940s Dugway, which was entirely closed off to the public. But despite the shift in the level of secrecy, much of Dugway's testing remains classified, preserving the skepticism and mysteriousness surrounding the facility.
You just have to see what's happened over the last 2 months. We now know that the first case manifested no later than December 1, even though China didn't reveal it to the WHO until a month later on December 31st, when they continued to hide it from their own citizens. And they continued to say that it had been contained inside Wuhan. Today, it is in every single province in China. They also claimed for almost 2 months until earlier this week that it had originated in a seafood market in Wuhan. That locals had contracted it from animals in, say, bat soup or snake tartare. That is not the case. The Lancet published a study last weekend demonstrating that of the original 40 cases, 14 of them had no contact with the seafood market, including patient 0. As one epidemiologist said, that virus went into the seafood market before it came out of the seafood market. We still don't know where it originated. Could have been another seafood market. Could have been a farm. Could have been a food processing company. I would note that Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens, to include, yes, coronavirus. Now,
there's a real issue around this because certainly police helicopters are basically platforms for cameras, and they're there for surveillance, or they're there for gauging what's happening on the ground. They're not there for lift and rescue. The ambulance service clearly haven't got a capability. The fire service, Anne?
We went into this matter in 1996. It's going to be very expensive to have it, and at that point in time, we didn't think we could justify the expense.
You could use large-scale military helicopters, but they would need large-scale landing places. Those landing places would have to be secured, and you'd have to get the injured from where they've been recovered to the helicopter, which is no mean feat.
We can now confirm that a tanker carrying chlorine has exploded at the junction of Shoreditch High Street and Commercial Street. Chlorine is extremely toxic in this form, and the police are issuing express warnings to people to stay indoors, close windows, and remain there until the all clear is given.
Well, that clearly changes the complexion of the whole thing completely.
Yeah.
I mean, chlorine is a highly toxic gas which causes severe burns if it comes in contact with skin, and more particularly causes very severe damage to the lungs. Now, if it's in the area they're saying, the London hospital is in that immediate vicinity. That's the one hospital that has a helicopter landing pad, as it happens. So that hospital might well be under threat.
I think we have a very serious position now with public morale and public information, because people will, I think, be reacting with terror. And I think the politicians and the people in Lance's position would now be wanting to get onto the media very, very quickly with any words of reassurance they could give about this, and I really don't know what they would be able to say.
Police are still urging people to stay indoors until the extent of the chlorine release is known. They are repeating again, it is extremely toxic.
OK, we want to bring in at this point Lynn Fernie, who is a safety consultant specialising in chemicals. Lynn, what would happen to the chlorine in an incident like this?
In this sort of incident where we have a tanker that's been ruptured, the gas is transported as a liquid under pressure. So what we'll have is a two-phase release. We'll have a gas cloud that's formed. It's moving very quickly away from the source, but because it's very dense, it's hugging the ground. So what I've got here is a map of the area. What we can see is in the inner circle here, the inner contour, the concentrations will be fatal, and that's some 600 metres from the tanker. Up to 1 kilometre away, we're still going to see people suffering major injuries. And above 2 kilometres away from the tanker, people outdoors are going to suffer a dangerous dose. And at that sort of dose, they're going to have burning eyes, nose, mouth. They may be suffering dizziness. They're probably going to feel quite ill, potentially vomiting.
First reports from the Commercial Street area suggest many casualties. One eyewitness has described a fog of greenish gas on the surrounding streets. Police are still urging people to stay indoors until the extent of the chlorine release is known. Well, let's go over now to Peter Cockcroft, who's at the London Weather Centre. Peter, how is the weather likely to affect that chlorine cloud?
Kirsty, the most important thing is the wind. Now, we've got high pressure out over the Atlantic, and that won't change over the next few hours. Now, that means light northwesterly winds across London, no more than 5 miles an hour. So the gas is likely to drift southeastwards across the East End. At the moment, the gas isn't dispersing very quickly. Now, that's down to the cloudy skies. But if the sun breaks through, that could cause more mixing and make the gas spread out more. Now, the advice from the emergency services is to stay indoors, and we'll be updating the situation continuously on our radio station, 94.9 FM.
Thank you, Peter.
if there are now bombs going off above ground, in this case a lorry being attacked, it could happen anywhere. So the potential for mass panic across not just the capital but the whole country is very much with us. I think therefore we need to look at more serious measures. We do have reserve powers in effect to take over the BBC if we were to wish to, and to get them to broadcast whatever we wanted them to broadcast. Those powers are there in the Broadcasting Act. My advice to the Prime Minister would be not to use those, but I think we should be talking to the broadcasters about having the Prime Minister on the air very quickly.
You wouldn't disagree with that, Michael, at all?
No, I entirely agree that the Prime Minister should be out there, and we shouldn't be using the powers to bring in the BBC, but we should certainly be talking to the broadcasters about the way in which the coverage is going to be organised.
London reporter Meena Sharma has managed to get onto a balcony overlooking Whitechapel, where the main impact of the chlorine gas will be felt. Meena.
As you can see, I'm wearing my protective suit as a precaution. A cordon has gone up around the area, and police are desperate for people to remain indoors. The gas itself is not visible from here as the cloud is drifting at ground level, but we understand it's heading towards Whitechapel and possibly the Isle of Dogs.
Without that mask, Meena, would you be able to smell the chlorine?
No, I'm simply too far away, and the cloud is moving away from me now. Of course, as it disperses, it becomes less toxic, less dangerous, but the police are still urging caution. We're all familiar with the smell of chlorine from swimming pools, but in this form, it's vital to stress it is a poisonous gas.
Do you have any idea about the number of casualties?
No, I haven't. First estimates suggest hundreds, maybe more, killed within the vicinity of the explosion itself, but we have no hard figures.
Thank you, Meena, for that. Well, clearly a very serious situation is emerging in Commercial Street. I am now able to bring you an update from Hyde Park, where 19 people have been confirmed dead.
Well, I think we have no experience of this. Vast numbers of casualties with serious lung injury, I suspect, and a lot of burns. I just don't think we've had the experience of having to deal with those sorts of numbers of patients.
It's unprecedented.
It's unprecedented, yes.